Wyatt Earp became a legend. Morgan Earp became a martyr. But Warren Earp, he became a monster. This is the brutal, blood-soaked life of Old West lawman Warren Earp. He was the youngest brother, the family enforcer, and the one who did the Earp's dirty work in the shadows until the shadows finally swallowed him whole. This is not a Hollywood myth. This is the true, terrifying story of a man who lived by the gun and died in the dirt. And before we get into it, just a quick reminder that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you end up enjoying this video and want to uncover more lost history, consider subscribing. It is free, and you can always change your mind. The burden of the bloodline. To understand how a man ends up dead in a pool of his own blood on a filthy saloon floor, you have to trace the poison back to its roots. You have to understand the suffocating forge that created Warren Baxter Earp. The Earp family tree was forged in an anvil of rigid discipline, severe hardship, and a fierce, almost tribal loyalty. The patriarch, Nicholas Porter Earp, was a stern, uncompromising, and highly litigious figure who had kicked and clawed his way across the expanding American continent. He was not a man who nurtured. He was a man who commanded. Nicholas had been a cavalry officer, a farmer, a bootlegger, and a judge. He learned early that the frontier respected only two things: force and blood. He raised his boys to view the outside world with deep, abiding suspicion. The earth, he taught them, was a hostile, predatory place where the weak were inevitably ground into the dirt and forgotten. To Nicholas, the law was not a moral absolute. It was a cudgel you used to beat your enemies into submission before they could do the same to you. Loyalty to the family was not merely a suggestion. It was an oath sworn in marrow. You backed your brother, right or wrong, to the gates of hell and beyond. If an Earp was bleeding, every Earp went to war. Born on March 9, 1855, in Pella, Iowa, Warren was the youngest of the family, the baby. And in a family of wolves, the youngest pup has the hardest time surviving the den. By the time Warren was old enough to hold a meaningful memory, his older brothers, James, Virgil, and Wyatt, were already battle-hardened men. They had survived the mechanized, bloody carnage of the Civil War, returning home with the hollow stares of men who had seen the absolute worst humanity had to offer. They did not stop there. They had ridden shotgun on swaying stagecoaches through hostile, uncharted territory where a single mistake meant a shallow grave. They had hunted buffalo on the sweeping, freezing plains. They had marshaled the violent, explosive cow towns of Kansas like Dodge City and Wichita. Wyatt and Virgil made their living cracking the skulls of drunken Texas cowboys with the heavy barrels of their revolvers, staring down lynch mobs without blinking. Their names were spoken in hushed, reverent tones in saloons across the frontier. To the world, they were lawmen. To Warren, they were titans. Warren grew up absorbing their towering myths. He listened, wide-eyed, to tales of gunfights, outlaws, and frontier justice. His young psychology permanently warped around a highly dangerous idea that violence was not a failure of diplomacy, but the primary, necessary tool of a real man. The men he idolized did not negotiate, they drew iron. But Warren had a secret problem, a problem that would eventually get him killed. He was sheltered. While his brothers were taming Dodge City and dodging bullets at Deadwood, Warren spent his formative years in the quiet, sun-baked agricultural town of Colton, California. He was not dodging bullets. He was picking fruit and sweeping floors. He was surrounded by the suffocating legend of his brothers, but he had not yet bled for the name. He was a mere spectator in his own family's dynasty. Every time Wyatt or Virgil passed through Colton, their long coats smelled of gun oil, trail dust, and a dangerous kind of freedom. Warren was left behind with the women and the elders. He practiced his quick draw in the mirror. He shot tin cans off wooden fence posts until he could not miss. He built up the physical muscle memory of a killer, but he had absolutely no outlet for it. The adrenaline festered. The inadequacy grew like a tumor. He was a young man desperate to prove he belonged to this elite brotherhood of iron, terrified that he was nothing more than a footnote carrying a heavy last name. That desperate, clawing need to prove himself would become his fatal flaw. It made him loud where Wyatt was quiet. It made him aggressive where Virgil was calculated. Warren did not just want to be an Earp. He wanted the world to fear him exactly the way they feared his brothers. Before we enter Tombstone, tell me in the comments, if you were raised to solve every problem with violence, could you just walk away? Or would you bite back to prove you belong? It was a psychological flaw that a booming silver town in the Arizona territory was about to exploit with ruthless, mechanical efficiency. In late 1879, the letters started arriving in Colton. Virgil wrote of a new camp in the desert, a place where the silver was practically leaking out of the rocks. It was a place where a man with a hard reputation and a fast gun could make a fortune overnight. The call went out to the clan. The wolves were gathering. But Tombstone was not just another dusty cow town. It was a high-pressure boiler designed to test the absolute breaking point of every man who walked its streets. Stick around, because Tombstone was about to strip away the facade and reveal exactly what Warren Earp was made of. And his breaking point was much closer than anyone knew. The meat grinder of Tombstone. In the autumn of 1880, the siren call of silver brought the Earp clan together. Warren, 25 years old, brimming with untested arrogance and eager for his piece of the family destiny, packed his bags and headed for Tombstone, Arizona. He did not arrive in a romantic frontier village. Tombstone was a sprawling industrial encampment built on a fragile crust of civility over a toxic ocean of human greed. Beneath the streets, men hacked fortunes out of suffocating darkness. The air down in the shafts was deadly, filled with noxious gases, the constant threat of cave-ins, and the sharp silica dust that slowly shredded a miner's lungs with every breath. Above ground, the atmosphere was hardly better. The town vibrated 24 hours a day with the deafening, bone-rattling roar of the massive stamp mills crushing silver ore. The ground shook enough to rattle glasses off the bar. The air was a choking mix of dust, smoke, whiskey, sweat, and the caustic chemical stench of cyanide and mercury used to separate the silver. It was a place where millionaires were made on a Tuesday and murdered in their beds on Wednesday, and murdered in their beds on Wednesday. The societal divide was sharp, political, and deadly. It was an economic war disguised as a turf battle. On one side stood the law and order faction. This included the northern business owners, the wealthy mine operators, Mayor John Clum, and the Earps. The Earps represented the eastern capital. They wore tailored black suits, secured powerful, lucrative positions as deputy U.S. marshals and city police, and wanted Tombstone civilized so investors from San Francisco and New York would keep sending money. On the other side were the cowboys. But these were not the romanticized cattle drivers of cinematic lore. The cowboys were a massive, loosely organized syndicate of rustlers, stage robbers, and ruthless killers who considered the sprawling, desolate Arizona-Mexico border their private, untouchable fiefdom. They wore red silk sashes around their waists like a military uniform. They numbered in the hundreds. They ran a highly lucrative black market economy. They stole cattle in Sonora, Mexico, smuggled them across the border, sold the beef to the U.S. Army and local butchers, and spent their bloody profits in Tombstone saloons. And they did not take kindly to men with tin badges telling them where they could and could not ride. Warren was immediately thrust into the secondary, supporting roles of the Earp machine. He did not get a shiny tin star right away. He was put to work as a bartender and a bouncer at the Oriental Saloon. The Oriental was a gilded palace of sin, where the air was so thick with the smoke of expensive Havana cigars and the desperate sweat of gamblers you could carve it with a Bowie knife. Men sat at the faro tables with revolvers resting openly next to their chips, trusting their iron more than the dealer. From behind the polished mahogany bar, Warren watched his brothers operate. He saw the way the crowded room instinctively parted like the Red Sea when Wyatt walked through the swinging doors. He saw the quiet deference. He saw the fear, and he deeply, desperately craved it. But Warren lacked the Earp chill. That terrifying, icy, detached calm made Wyatt a god among men. Wyatt could look a hostile, drunken gunman in the eye and watch the man's courage evaporate into thin air without ever letting his hand drift toward his holster. Wyatt used psychology as a weapon, breaking a man's will before a gun was ever drawn. Warren could not do that. Warren was a live wire ready to snap. He was the brother who would throw a devastating right hook over a perceived insult. He was the man who would aggressively draw a gun because someone looked at his family sideways. He possessed all of the Earp aggression, but none of the restraint. This extreme volatility made him a highly visible target for the cowboy faction. Men like Guy Clanton, Johnny Ringo, and the McClory brothers were predators who knew how to spot a vulnerability. They saw Warren as the weak link in the Earp chain. To them, he was the arrogant pup they could harass, push, and violently provoke to get a reaction from the big dogs. They taunted him in the dirt streets, mocking his lack of a badge. They deliberately pushed against his shoulders in the crowded saloons, waiting for him to snap. They were constantly probing the Earp defenses, looking for a psychological stress fracture to break the family apart. The unrelenting pressure began to visibly warp Warren's mind. He lived in a state of exhausting hypervigilance. His nervous system was constantly flooded with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol. Every time a saloon door swung open, his hand drifted toward the worn leather of his holster. Every whisper in a dark alley was a calculated threat. The physiological toll of waiting for an ambush degrades a man. He became a person living in a permanent, vibrating state of warfare, waiting for the inevitable spark. The frontier itself was an active participant in this psychological decay. What history often smooths over is the sheer, brutal physical reality of the environment. It was not just the men who were trying to kill you, it was the land itself. To survive in the Arizona Territory in the 1880s, a man had to be made of leather, grit, and a stoic capacity for immense suffering. Warren spent his days navigating the brutal friction of this landscape. When he was not pouring drinks, he rode the stage lines. He sat high on the exposed box with a heavy double-barreled scattergun across his lap, scanning the jagged, shimmering horizons of the Dragoon Mountains for Apache war parties or masked highwaymen. Geronimo was still actively leading raids during this period, turning the open desert into a graveyard. The sun beat down like a physical weight, baking the landscape in 100-degree heat. The alkaline dust coated his throat, burning his lungs with every breath, tasting of salted, dry earth. He worked as a ranch hand, driving stubborn cattle through mesquite and scrub brush equipped with thorns that could tear a horse's flanks and a man's shins to bloody ribbons. The reality of the West for Warren Earp was 99% grueling, soul-crushing boredom and physical exhaustion, punctuated by 1% of sheer, unadulterated terror. In Tombstone, the concept of the law was deeply, fundamentally corrupt. It was a fluid, subjective weapon wielded by whoever had the most guns and the most money. Warren saw firsthand how the local county sheriff, Johnny Behan, operated. Behan was a slick politician who played both sides. He collected taxes for the county, skimming a percentage off the top, while intentionally turning a blind eye to the cowboys' massive rustling operations in exchange for political support, votes, and heavy bribes. The courts were easily bought. Judges were intimidated. Juries were utterly terrified of cowboy retribution, knowing that a guilty verdict could mean a midnight visit from men with ropes. Warren learned quickly that a piece of stamped tin meant absolutely nothing if the man wearing it was not willing to pull a trigger and watch a man bleed out to enforce it. This dark cynicism seeped deep into his marrow. It stripped away whatever civilized idealism he might have brought from California. It likely convinced him that the only justice he could trust, uncorrupted justice to be found in this brutal world, was the justice that exploded out of the end of a six-shooter. He was often seen as the family's enforcer. In the smoky, gas-lit saloons, Warren was a figure of quiet, vibrating menace. If an unruly drunk was causing trouble for the faro dealers, Warren was the man sent to drag him out by his collar, tossing him violently into the muddy street. If a cowboy was heard making loud threats against Virgil or Wyatt, Warren was the one who stalked out into the freezing night to find him, confronting him with clenched fists and a heavy, loaded revolver pressed hard into the man's ribs. He lived in a predatory ecosystem where reputation was the only currency that mattered. If you let a single insult pass unanswered, you were marked as a coward. If you showed a momentary flash of hesitation, you were prey. Consequently, Warren doubled down on the violent reputation of his family name. He used the word Earp like a heavy iron bludgeon, shutting down arguments through sheer terrifying intimidation. But beneath the bluster and the bloody knuckles, Warren was drifting. He was a man without an anchor. He had no wife to go home to, no lucrative mining claims to build wealth upon, no grand vision for a future. He was entirely consumed by the present moment, a shadow trailing behind giants, waiting for his turn to step into the light. Warren thought he was untouchable as long as he stood in his brother's towering shadows. But do not look away just yet. Shadows offer absolutely no protection when the real bullets finally start flying, and Tombstone was about to explode. The murder that changed everything. On October 26, 1881, the suffocating tension in Tombstone finally snapped. It did not end with a negotiation or a gavel striking wood. It ended in a narrow, freezing, vacant lot behind the OK Corral. 30 seconds. That is all it took to alter the course of American history. 30 seconds of deafening, chaotic gunfire. 30 shots fired at point-blank range, the air instantly thick with the blinding, acrid smoke of black powder. It was a mechanical, brutal exchange of kinetic energy. Lead tore through heavy wool coats, shattered bone, and pierced lungs. When the smoke finally cleared, drifting away on the bitter autumn wind, 3 cowboys, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton, lay dead or dying. Their blood pooled rapidly in the cold Arizona dirt. Virgil and Morgan were bleeding from severe bullet wounds. Wyatt stood miraculously untouched. But Warren was not there. He was hundreds of miles away in Colton, California, sent on a mundane family errand. While his brothers were standing shoulder to shoulder in the most legendary street fight of the 19th century, facing down a syndicate of killers, Warren was safe. For a man utterly consumed by the need to prove his worth, there is nothing more agonizing than the shame of safety. He missed the defining, immortal moment of his family's history. By the time the news reached him and he made the grueling journey back to Tombstone, the town had completely turned. Warren did not return to a hero's welcome. He walked into a heavily armed prison. The cowboy faction had staged the largest funeral in Tombstone's history for their fallen comrades. A procession of hundreds marched through the streets in a massive silent threat directed entirely at the Earps. The town was violently polarized. The Earps were no longer seen by the public simply as stern lawmen doing a dirty job. Half the town, terrified of cowboy retaliation, now viewed them as cold-blooded, calculating murderers. The Earps were stripped of their authority. Death threats were scrawled on paper and slipped under the doors of their homes in the dead of night. They were indicted for murder, forced to sit through a month-long preliminary hearing while men they had policed glared at them from the gallery. Then came the cowardly, inevitable retaliation. Midnight. December 28, 1881. Virgil Earp stepped out of the Oriental Saloon and began the short walk back to his hotel. From the pitch-black shadows of an unfinished brick building across the street, assassins wielding double-barreled shotguns opened fire. The blasts tore through the silence of the night like a cannon. At that close range, buckshot does not just puncture, it obliterates. The heavy lead balls struck Virgil's left side, completely shattering his humerus bone, turning it into jagged splinters. The kinetic force picked him up and slammed him to the sawdust-covered street. His side was riddled with lead, the remaining buckshot embedding deep into the brick wall behind him. He survived by pure, stubborn Earp grit, but the damage was permanent. The arm was ruined. He would be crippled for the rest of his life. The Earps were now completely surrounded, trapped in a town they had bled to protect. They barricaded themselves inside the Cosmopolitan Hotel. They slept in shifts with loaded shotguns resting directly across their knees. When they had to move, they walked aggressively down the absolute center of the wide dirt streets, utterly refusing to walk on the boardwalks where an alleyway ambush could end them. Warren's return to this claustrophobic war zone was marked by a profound, dark shift in his psychology. Seeing Virgil's ruined body and Morgan's paranoid eyes broke something fundamental inside him. The guilt of being absent for the OK Corral morphed into a rabid, untethered aggression. The desperate, gnawing need to compensate consumed him entirely. He wanted to bleed for his brothers. He wanted to prove, once and for all, that he was not just the kid brother who stayed home. He was not just the kid brother who stayed home. He armed himself to the teeth. He began openly carrying 2 revolvers, shedding any pretense of being a civilian. He did not just walk the streets of Tombstone, he hunted for eye contact. He aggressively stared down any cowboy sympathizer, any corrupt politician, and any man who dared look his way, silently begging them to give him a reason to draw. The social contract had completely disintegrated. The law had failed them. The courts were bought and paid for by cowboy silver. The tin badge pinned to Wyatt's chest was no longer a shield. It was a bullseye. The Earps were done waiting for the legal system to protect them. Keep watching, because they were about to trade their useless tin badges for the cold, hard, indisputable justice of a Winchester rifle. The Bloody Path of Revenge. March 18, 1882. The night the world turned a deep, suffocating red. It was a Saturday night. A cool, crisp wind blew through the dusty streets of Tombstone. Warren Earp, the brother everyone loved, the handsome, joking, vibrant heart of the family, was playing a game of billiards at Campbell and Hatch's saloon. Wyatt was watching quietly from the sidelines, leaning against the wall. Outside, in the pitch blackness of the alley, assassins crept up to the glass-windowed back door. A sudden, deafening roar shattered the gentle clatter of the billiard balls. A heavy-caliber bullet ripped through the glass, tore directly through Morgan's spine, and shattered his vital organs. He collapsed to the floor, instantly paralyzed. A second shot roared through the window, narrowly missing Wyatt's head, violently splintering the woodwork behind him. They carried Morgan's broken body to a lounge table. The doctor was summoned, but one horrific look at the wound was enough. Warren Earp was dying. He lingered for an agonizing hour, his brothers surrounding him, completely helpless. He whispered his final words to Wyatt, a quiet secret between brothers, and then the light permanently faded from his eyes. Wyatt Earp's face turned to stone. The legendary Earp chill descended over him like a shroud of Arctic ice. The courts had failed. The badges had failed. The time for warrants and arrests was over. If the law failed your family, would you have the stomach to become a monster to avenge them? State your verdict in the comments. Would you ride with Warren or walk away? The time for the vendetta had begun. For Warren, the crushing grief was instantaneously sublimated into pure, white-hot, homicidal rage. Wyatt rapidly organized a posse. Officially, they held federal warrants from the U.S. Marshal. Unofficially, it was a heavily armed death squad. They were joined by the deadly Dennis Doc Holliday, Texas, Jack Vermillion, Sherman McMaster, and Turkey Creek, Jack Johnson. And riding right beside them, heavily armed, eyes burning with hatred and ready to kill, was Warren Earp. They rode out into the freezing Arizona wilderness, a jagged, unforgiving landscape of granite canyons and blinding alkali flats. The rain poured down in freezing sheets, turning the ground to mud. They barely slept. They ate cold beans out of tins, their eyes scanning every ridge. This was not a noble quest for frontier justice. It was a vendetta. Every man involved was going to pay in blood. The first to fall was Frank Stillwell. They tracked him to the bustling train yard in Tucson. Stillwell had been seen running from the alley the night Morgan was assassinated. The Earps were at the station escorting Virgil's train to California, ensuring the crippled brother got out of the territory alive. As the train pulled away, Wyatt and Warren spotted Stillwell lurking in the shadows of the flat cars. In the dark, amidst the hissing steam of the massive locomotive engines and the heavy iron clang of the tracks, they cornered him. Stillwell realized he was trapped. He looked into the cold, dead eyes of Wyatt Earp, and he saw the untethered fury of Warren. He begged. He pleaded for his life, throwing his hands up in the shadows of the rail cars, slipping on the wet gravel. They did not give him an inch. The posse opened fire at point-blank range. The deafening roar of shotguns and lever-action rifles echoed off the steel trains. The official coroner's report would later state that Frank Stillwell was hit by multiple rounds from different calibers. 6 bullets tore through his body. The buckshot was fired at such close range that the powdered burns permanently tattooed his flesh. It was a collective, ritualistic execution. They poured hot lead into him until his body was broken, shattered, and utterly unrecognizable. Warren watched the bright muzzle flashes light up the rail yard. He participated in the slaughter. The man who helped kill his beloved brother was erased from the earth in a storm of fire and smoke. No badge could save him now. He was an outlaw in the eyes of the territory. The hunter had become the hunted, but the Earps did not care. They were on a mission from hell itself. Next was Florentino Cruz, a cowboy affiliate they believed had acted as a lookout during Morgan's murder. They found him hiding in a remote wood camp. Wyatt, acting as executioner, brutally interrogated him. When Cruz confessed to his involvement, weeping in the dirt, he was given a brief moment to pray. Then the firing squad opened up. Warren stood shoulder to shoulder in the line, his Winchester hot in his hands, watching as another name was violently crossed off the bloody ledger. But the most terrifying confrontation was yet to come. It was a shootout that would test the absolute limits of Warren Earp's sanity. The climax of the vendetta ride occurred at a desolate, sun-scorched watering hole called Iron Springs. The posse, weary, exhausted, and riding through extreme heat, blundered directly into a massive cowboy ambush. Waiting for them was Curly Bill, Brocious, the ruthless, terrifying leader of the cowboy faction, along with nearly a dozen heavily armed men hidden in the brush. The cowboys opened fire with a devastating, coordinated volley. Texas Jack's horse was killed instantly, dropping like a stone. The posse scrambled frantically for the cover of the rocks. But Wyatt Earp did not run. He stepped down from his panicked horse, wearing a long, heavy coat that practically dragged in the dust, and walked directly into the blinding hail of lead. With unnatural, terrifying calm, he raised a double-barreled shotgun, aimed at Curly Bill, and pulled both triggers. The massive blast hit the cowboy leader in the midsection, nearly tearing the man in half, dropping him into the spring, while Wyatt stood completely exposed in the open, miraculously untouched by the bullets tearing his coat to shreds. Warren held the line from the rear. He laid down a wall of suppressing fire, his knuckles white against the stock of his rifle, firing round after round into the cowboy positions until the barrel of his Winchester literally burned the skin off his palms. Bullets zipped past his ears like angry hornets, snapping branches and kicking up violent geysers of dirt into his eyes. He tasted the sharp copper of pure fear in his mouth, overwhelmed by the sulphurous, choking stench of black powder. They survived. They broke the ambush and drove the cowboys off into the desert. But in those grueling weeks of slaughter, Warren Earp was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. He was baptized in the dark, heavy religion of revenge. He learned that the only thing more powerful than the law, more powerful than a badge or a judge, was a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Warren survived the vendetta ride, but the man who rode back out of those mountains was not the same boy who went in. Do not click away, because the West had permanently broken him, and now it was going to slowly devour him. A broken man on the run. When the thick, sulphurous smoke finally cleared and the desert dust settled over the fresh graves in Tombstone, the Earp brothers scattered across the West like ashes caught in a violent windstorm. They were exiled from the territory they had once ruled with iron fists, wanted for murder by the territorial governor, fleeing in the dead of night. The tight-knit clan that Nicholas Earp had forged was forever broken. Wyatt went north and west. He possessed a chameleon-like ability to adapt to the changing times. He chased gold rushes in the freezing mud of Alaska, ran highly lucrative, glittering saloons in Idaho, and eventually settled into the comfortable, sun-drenched warmth of Los Angeles. There, he became a highly sought-after consultant for early Hollywood westerns, rubbing elbows with famous directors like John Ford and actors like John Ford and actors like John Wayne. Wyatt meticulously curated his own myth, sanitizing the blood and the mud out of his history. He became the immortal hero of the American story, the man who survived to dictate the narrative to a public desperate for clean, uncomplicated romance. Warren went into the tall grass. The agonizing years that followed the vendetta were a slow, degrading blur of drifting and decay. Warren became a man completely haunted by the very myth he had helped forge in blood. He moved endlessly, restlessly, unable to sleep in the same bed for more than a few weeks. Yuma, San Bernardino, El Paso, Colton, Wilcox. The name Earp, once a badge of immense, terrifying power, was now a heavy, suffocating millstone chained around his neck. Everywhere he went, his bloody reputation preceded him like a dark storm front. The 1880s gave way to the 1890s, and the Wild West was rapidly, irreversibly dying. The telegraph wires crisscrossed the plains, erasing the isolation that outlaws thrived in. The heavy iron railroads connected the coasts, bringing Eastern civilization, police forces, and judges. The rugged, lawless frontier was being fenced in by barbed wire, modern industry, and bureaucracy. The days of settling disputes with a six-shooter in the center of the street were ending. The gunfighter was going extinct, replaced by the lawyer, the accountant, and the politician. But Warren was a relic, a man built for a world that no longer existed. He did not know how to exist in a civilized society that settled its grievances with paperwork instead of lead. He took jobs where his specific, highly violent set of skills was still temporarily valued. He worked as a private detective, hiring muscle for cattle barons. He guarded stagecoaches across the blistering, desolate stretches of the desert, sitting on the box with a shotgun, hoping a highwayman would be foolish enough to try his luck. For a time, he worked as a civilian scout for the 4th Cavalry, using his unparalleled tracking skills to hunt Apache holdouts in the deep, deadly canyons of the Southwest. It was brutal, exhausting work. The military valued his grit and his terrifying lack of hesitation when it came time to pull the trigger. But even the United States Army, an institution built on organized violence, could not stomach his insubordination. He refused to follow orders from officers he deemed weak. The rigid structure of the military could not contain his volatile, explosive temper. The things he had seen, the men he had killed, they crawled directly behind his eyes every single time he closed them. The smell of black powder and the copper tang of fresh blood were permanently etched into his olfactory memory. Warren turned heavily to the bottle. Cheap, burning whiskey was the only solvent strong enough to wash away the memories. It was the only thing that quieted the constant high-pitched ringing in his ears. It was the only anesthetic that temporarily drowned out the booming echoes of the shotgun blasts at Iron Springs and the desperate gurgling screams of Frank Stillwell dying in the dirt of the Tucson rail yard. But the alcohol was a poison that simultaneously fueled his rage. When he drank, the Earp temper flared into an uncontrollable inferno. He became a vicious brawler. He was arrested repeatedly across multiple states for public intoxication, for disturbing the peace, and for viciously beating men in saloons until their faces were unrecognizable pulps. He became a professional brother, a man who lived entirely on the dark, fading periphery of his family's towering legend. He would walk into a crowded bar, slam his calloused fist on the wood, loudly announce that he was Warren Earp, and wait for someone to challenge him. Drunks, fools, and aspiring gunfighters looking to make a quick reputation desperately wanted to be the man who whipped an Earp. Warren happily obliged them. He used his fists, his boots, and the butt of his revolver, usually leaving his challengers bloody, broken, and unconscious on the floorboards. It was a pathetic, degrading pursuit of the adrenaline high he had experienced during the vendetta. He was chasing something he could never get back, but finding only cheap, sad brawls in backwater towns. He grew deeply, toxically bitter. He watched from afar as Wyatt became a celebrated, wealthy figure, insulated from the consequences of their shared past. Warren remained a man of the dirt, scraping by on a meager, humiliating existence. His older brothers tried to save him. Virgil, working steadily at law enforcement in California, tried repeatedly to keep an eye on him. They sent him money. They offered him stable jobs and a roof over his head. But you cannot domesticate a stray dog of war. You cannot tame a man who has tasted that much adrenaline, perpetrated that much violence, and carried that much profound, unprocessed grief. His downward spiral accelerated. In Lamar, Colorado, he was involved in a series of highly violent altercations that nearly saw him chased out of town by an angry lynch mob holding ropes. He barely escaped with his life. In California, local newspapers ran editorials viewing him not as a frontier hero, but as a dangerous public nuisance, a drunk to be locked up and forgotten. By 1893, the pull of his past was too strong. He was back in Arizona, driving stages and working as a range detective. He had returned to the scene of the crime. He was a ghost haunting the very territory that had destroyed his youth. He was incredibly lonely, chronically angry, and increasingly dangerously paranoid. He trusted no one. He felt the crushing, impossible weight of his brother's massive expectations pressing down on him, contrasted sharply with the stark, humiliating reality of his own continuous failures. He was a predator in a world that was quickly becoming a pasture. He was the fifth brother, the forgotten one, a heavily armed specter drifting aimlessly through the desert, simply waiting for the inevitable, violent end of his trail. Stay with me, because the final shootout in a Wilcox saloon is unlike anything you have seen in the movies. How does a man who survived the deadliest, most heavily armed gunfights in frontier history finally meet his end? Not in a blaze of cinematic glory, not in a heroic, bullet-riddled last stand against a dozen outlaw men, but in a squalid, forgotten saloon, facing a man who had absolutely no business holding a gun. The saloon floor, 1900. July 6, 1900, Wilcox, Arizona, the dawn of the 20th century. The rest of the country was eagerly looking forward to the marvels of the modern age. Steel rails were connecting oceans, telegraph wires buzzed with commerce, and electric lights were chasing away the dark. The era of the wild frontier was rapidly closing, but Warren Earp was hopelessly, tragically stuck in 1882. He was 45 years old, but the desert and the bottle had aged him into a broken man of 65. His face was deeply lined, a leathery, sun-baked map charting every mile of alkaline desert he had crossed, and every gallon of cheap burning whiskey he had consumed to numb the memories. His hands, once steady enough to drop a running man at 50 yards with a Winchester rifle, now possessed a slight, uncontrollable nervous tremor. He was a ghost haunting a world that no longer had room for gunfighters. He walked into the headquarters saloon. The summer heat in Wilcox was oppressive, a suffocating blanket that made the air inside the saloon heavy with the familiar scent of stale beer, damp sawdust, cigar smoke, and human desperation. Men stood along the bar seeking refuge from the blinding Arizona sun. Warren ordered a drink, his voice carrying that familiar grating arrogance, and stood aggressively at the mahogany bar. He drank not for pleasure, but for maintenance, to quiet the ghosts. A few feet away stood a man named Johnny Boyett. Boyett was a local ranch hand, a man who had been around the territory long enough to know the history of the men who stood beside him. He knew the Earps. He had worked for the Hook and Spear Ranch, and Warren had worked for the nearby cattle interests. They were both hard men of the saddle, but Boyett was tired. He was tired of the heavy-handed intimidation, the bullying, and the sheer unearned arrogance that always accompanied the youngest Earp. Boyett represented the working men of the New West, men who just wanted to draw a wage without having to bow to fading royalty. The argument started small. It was the kind of petty, meaningless nonsense fueled by the oppressive heat, too many rounds of rotgut, and old, imagined grievances. Some historical records claim it was a dispute over a woman. Others point to an unpaid financial debt or lingering resentments from the old cowboy days. But at its core, it was about Warren aggressively asserting his dominance and Boyett finally refusing to bow his head to a fading name. Warren, drunk and deeply tired of the world, leaned into Boyett's space. He began to brutally bully the ranch hand. He pushed him physically, jabbing a hard, calloused finger into Boyett's chest, backing him against the wood. He mocked his courage in front of the other patrons, his voice dripping with venom. He treated Boyett exactly the way he used to treat the Clantons in the alleys of Tombstone, with absolute, unyielding contempt. "You're a coward, Boyett," Warren sneered, his voice cutting cleanly through the smoky din of the saloon, silencing the room. "Go get your guns. I'll be right here." Boyett, humiliated, his face burning with fury and absolute terror, backed away. He practically ran out the swinging doors of the saloon, disappearing into the glaring daylight. The room went dead silent. The piano player stopped mid-chord, his hands hovering over the keys. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. Every man in that room knew the ironclad rules of the Old West. When a man with a reputation like Warren Earp tells another man to go fetch his iron, you do not stick around to watch the show unless you are prepared to catch a stray bullet in your gut. Men quietly placed coins on the bar, leaving their drinks half full, and slipped quickly out the back door. Most men would have seen the heavy, undeniable shadow of death standing in the doorway and walked away. But Warren Earp stayed. He stood completely alone at the bar, his back to the door. It was a final, staggeringly arrogant act of defiance. He ordered another drink, tossing it back smoothly, the liquor burning a familiar trail down his throat. He thought the name Earp was an impenetrable armor. He thought that no mere ranch hand would ever have the nerve, the sheer audacity, to pull a trigger on the brother of the legendary Wyatt Earp. Or perhaps he was just too tired to keep running. Minutes ticked by like hours. The only sound in the suffocating silence was the rhythmic metallic ticking of the clock behind the bar, the buzzing of a trapped horsefly, and Warren's heavy whiskey-laced breathing. Then the swinging doors creaked open, breaking the silence. Johnny Boyett stood in the entryway, silhouetted against the bright street. He held two revolvers, one gripped tightly in each hand, the hammers already pulled back. He was trembling violently. His face was pale as a sheet, stripped of all color. His eyes were wide with the specific, highly dangerous terror of a cornered animal. Fear is the absolute most dangerous thing a man can carry into a gunfight, because a terrified man will not hesitate. He will pull the trigger simply to make the nightmare stop. Warren turned slowly. He did not rush. He did not flinch. He did not reach for his hip. In a tragic, almost unbelievable twist of fate, or perhaps a deep subconscious desire to finally end the exhausting, decades-long struggle, Warren was unarmed. He had left his revolver in his hotel room. He was a gunfighter without a gun, facing a terrified man holding two. He opened his long coat wide, exposing his bare chest, offering himself as a massive target to the man he had just bullied. He thought he could stare Boyett down. He thought the legendary Earp chill would finally work for him, just this once. He thought he could freeze the man's trigger finger with a glare. "You've got your guns," Warren barked, his voice echoing loudly off the wooden rafters filled with mocking, fatal disdain. "Why don't you use them?" Boyett fired. The first shot shattered the silence like a thunderclap, deafening in the enclosed space. The heavy lead bullet missed Warren entirely, burying itself with a dull thud into the floorboards near his boots. The remaining patrons, the bartender, and a few brave souls scrambled frantically for cover, diving behind heavy oak tables and the brass rail of the bar. Warren did not flinch. He did not dive for cover. He did not beg. Instead, he took a deliberate heavy step forward, walking directly into the barrel of the gun. Boyett fired again. The second shot was true. The heavy lead slug hit Warren dead center in the chest. It ripped violently through his ribs, tearing through his heart and lungs with devastating kinetic force. Warren Earp did not die like a hero in a dime novel. He did not have a grand, sweeping final monologue about justice or family. He did not reach for a phantom gun in a blaze of cinematic glory. He simply crumpled. Life instantly left his legs. He hit the sawdust-covered floor with a heavy, wet, utterly undignified thud. He collapsed against the bar, leaving a dark smear of blood behind him against the polished mahogany wood. He lay in a pooling mixture of cheap beer, dirt, and his own lifeblood. His chest heaved once, twice. He gasped his last ragged, bubbling breath, staring up at the wooden ceiling. The baby of the Earp family had finally found the peace that had violently eluded him for 45 turbulent years. Johnny Boyett did not run. He stood trembling, the smoke clearing from the barrels of his guns, before immediately surrendering to the local authorities. At the subsequent coroner's inquest, Boyett claimed absolute self-defense. He argued successfully that Warren Earp's reputation was so terrifying, his history so incredibly bloody, and his physical threats so entirely credible, that he had no choice but to fire, even though Warren was technically unarmed at the exact moment of the shooting. The jury was composed of local men who knew exactly who Warren was and what the Earp name represented. They agreed. Boyett was completely acquitted. The law officially decided that the name Warren Earp was a deadly weapon in and of itself, sufficient to justify a public execution in a crowded room. Even in his final moments, Warren was betrayed by the very legend he had fought, bled, and died to uphold, the final dust. Warren Earp was buried in a lonely, sun-baked grave in the Wilcox Pioneer Cemetery, 1,000 miles away from the Hollywood glamour that would soon immortalize his brothers. For decades, the dirt above him remained entirely unmarked. There was no grand marble headstone, no poetic epitaph detailing his bravery, no flowers left by grieving citizens. He was quietly edited out of the romantic narrative, a man too messy, too angry, and far too tragically human to be molded into a clean, shining Western hero. The West did not just forge legends. It consumed the men who could not carry the weight of them. Not everyone was a Wyatt Earp. Most men were Warrens, flawed, broken individuals crushed between the romanticized myth of the frontier and its unforgiving reality. He was the fifth son, the forgotten shadow, a man who lived by the gun and died by it on a filthy saloon floor, leaving behind nothing but an echo in the Arizona wind.